Welcome back to MOTOBLADE, everyone. I know it's been a couple of weeks, but we got all kinds of new gadgets and toys to play with. We got the Hero 7 Black, and we're going to do a review of that coming up. But today we're going to talk about sport bikes versus cruisers. Which one is best for you? Which one should you buy? Which one is better? Full disclaimer, guys, I have never owned a sport bike. The closest thing I owned was what they called a sport cruiser, which was my Kawasaki Vulcan S. So I cannot speak directly to the maintenance and maintenance issues that you may have or you may experience when you own a sport bike. But I have some references from people who do own them, and I'll talk a little bit about that from their perspective. But first up, let's talk about the pros and cons of sport bikes. So the first pro is generally sport bikes are fast. Cruisers can be fast as well, especially on acceleration, but sport bikes, a lot of them have a greater top end speed, and depending how crazy you go and how big of a sport bike you get, you could end up with what they call race car-like acceleration and top end speed. I mean, you can get some seriously fast bikes like a CBR 1000, of course Ducatis, and the Kawasaki Ninja H2, I think. That thing is just a beast. So you can get some pretty insane sport bikes that have a ridiculous top end speed, way faster than you could ever possibly need unless you are actually buying it for the purpose of racing. To go along with that top speed, you're also looking at some good braking systems. Generally, all sport bikes now have dual floating ABS disc brakes, as well as an adjustable suspension. And that might only be on the higher end sport bikes, but still a lot of sport bikes come with a good adjustable suspension that you guys can tune yourself. Most of the pros of a sport bike generally focus around the top end speed and acceleration. They are insanely fun to ride, and I have ridden them, and they're just absolutely thrilling if you're going to ride them fast, but you have to have the skills to do that. You got to be able to learn how to drag a knee if you're going to really push them to their boundaries. But they're fun, and generally they have some really good high-tech stuff, not necessarily in the form of gauges, although sometimes they do have awesome high-tech touchscreens, but mostly in just the fuel injection and all of the actual mechanical tech of the bike. They're amazing feats of engineering, so they are pretty awesome in that regard. But let's talk about some of the cons of a sport bike as well. The first con is they are not really comfortable, especially not for long distance. If you're gonna just take a short ride around town or maybe do a speed run somewhere, great. But you want to take a nice long trip, like I do an 8 to 9 hour day on my motorcycle, and I'm super comfortable the whole way. You try and do that on a sport bike, that ain't happening. Your butt will be numb. You won't have a butt left. Okay, your ass will just be gone. So they are not comfortable for long distances at all. A sport bike's biggest pro is also its biggest con, because within first to second gear, most of those sport bikes can exceed speed limits worldwide. And so out of 6 gears, you can hit speed limits in first or second with those bikes. And so you could be looking at some tickets there, and it also requires, like I said, skills if you're going to actually ride them at that kind of speed. So sport bikes are pretty fun, very fast, but they require skill, and they could get you into a lot of trouble. Let's go over the pros of my favorite bikes, cruisers. Cruisers are generally easier to ride and very comfortable. In fact, most people learn to ride on a cruiser of some kind in a motorcycle safety course. And cruisers are just generally easier to control and more comfortable for newer riders, so most people prefer to start out on them. Speaking of cruisers, there's an old Harley. In addition to being easy and comfortable to ride, they're just generally more comfortable for touring. You can set up a cruiser to do longer rides and longer touring trips, and you can usually have a 2-up setup. So if you're going to carry a second person, yeah, you can do that on a sport bike. Most sport bikes have a 2-up seat or a way to make it a 2-up seat, but cruisers are going to be far more comfortable if you're going to carry a passenger, or if you're going to do any kind of touring with it. A cruiser is definitely the way to go there. The features on a cruiser can also be far more extensive as far as creature comforts. For example, you're not going to find an entertainment system like this on a sport bike, where I have a full speaker system and I can even get surround sound speakers if I set the bike up for touring. Oh, my mom's calling. There's another feature. Hello. Okay, so as you guys kind of saw there, I had a phone call come in. So features that you're probably not going to get on a sport bike is a screen with, you know, entertainment, phone connectivity. This screen will show me text messages. Harley has their own version of this as well. I think it's called the boombox system. It's pretty good. Not as good as Indians, but I digress. So those are some features that cruisers have because you have the room and you have the space. Cruisers are also, in my opinion, more stylish and sexy than sport bikes. And that's just my opinion. There are some good looking sport bikes out there, and I know that's going to be totally subjective to the person who is looking to buy a bike, but I think cruisers just look awesome. That's my personal opinion there. One other good thing about cruisers compared to sport bikes, and again, I have only owned cruisers, so I am going off of what other people have told me about differences between their cruisers and sport bikes, but cruisers are generally way easier to maintain as far as oil changes and doing any kind of maintenance yourself. Cruisers are generally far more easy to maintain and also a bit cheaper to maintain. Now, certain bikes, like more common sport bikes, I guess, like Honda CBRs or Kawasaki Ninjas, you know, it's kind of commonplace, almost like a Chevy, so those parts aren't going to be too expensive. But if you've got an expensive or fancy Ducati sport bike, that is generally going to be a little bit more expensive to maintain, and maybe even harder to do the maintenance on yourself. Harleys and Indians, they can be expensive to maintain if you go to the dealership for your services, but if you can do the maintenance yourself, like the oil changes and whatnot, it's fairly easy and not a big deal, and a lot easier than a sport bike, at least I have been told. One other pro of the cruisers is I love that acceleration and that roar of the pipes. You don't get big pipes like that on the sport bikes. I guess you could put a Aprilia aftermarket exhaust on them and make them sound pretty cool, but I like the sound of a cruiser way better. Alright, so some of the cons now of a cruiser. One, they are generally a lot more expensive. You can pick up a good sport bike for well under $5,000. And, well, you know, even my Kawasaki Vulcan S, which was a sport cruiser, that was under $5,000. But sport bikes will generally be cheaper than cruisers. And I'm going to have a video on my top 5 bikes for under $5,000. And most of those bikes that I mentioned are going to be sport bikes. So you can generally get a sport bike a lot cheaper. Cruisers are generally more expensive. Cruisers are also usually bigger and heavier. So if you don't want a real heavy bike, or that is something that, you know, you're a bit intimidated by, it took me a little bit to get used to a heavy bike, but now I flick it around and it's no big deal. I don't even notice the weight anymore. But that can be an intimidating factor for some people, or maybe you just don't want something that big. Cruisers are generally going to be much bigger and heavier. And finally, for the last con that I have for cruisers, kind of goes back to the pro of sport bikes. Cruisers have great acceleration, some of them do at least, and I like cruisers. I think they're awesome, but they don't have the top end speed that you're going to get in a sport bike. So if you are a speed junkie and that's what you're looking for, a cruiser may not be your best option. So that's it for my pros and cons today on sport bikes versus cruisers. Let me know what you guys think. Is there anything that I missed? Anything I should have included? If you guys own both a sport bike and a cruiser, let me know what you think the difference is between them that maybe I missed, or maybe you think is even more crucial. If you own any motorcycle, talk to me down below. Why did you choose the bike you did? Was it one of the reasons I mentioned or something else? If you haven't already, hit the thumbs up button. That lets me know that you guys like the video and you like what I'm doing here on the channel, and I really appreciate that. And if you have not already, please subscribe to the channel. It's the big red button that says subscribe, really hard to miss. Click the bell icon next to it and you guys will get notified when I have new videos ready. Also, check out my Patreon. I just got that set up and going. If you guys want to help support the channel in a bigger and better way, Patreon's the place to do it. I'll throw a link to that on the end of the screen here as well, and down in the description and on my main channel page. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Until next time, y'all, be careful out there. Ride safe, ride on, and I will catch all of you later. Deuces!